Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of the Pause Reviews podcast. The podcast where, at least for now, we pick random movies from the streaming interwebs and comb through all the nonsense to find something awesome for you to watch tonight. As always, I'm your host, Frank, joined by my trusty cohort and co-host, Tim?
Yeah. Yeah, you got a little bit of time to continue to give us, random stuff to watch before we take no more requests and just do things on a predetermined list.
Well, we would still do requests for the live shows and stuff.
No.
Yeah. Take it. Wait, no? Oh, all right. Apparently Tim's in charge now.
I forgot about that part.
And that's why you're the co-host.
That's true.
Stay in your lane, bro.
Hey, just wait. I feel like in this episode, you're going to unmuzzle me, and it's going to be hard to shut me back up.
Oh, that is true. I know. This is like when we do Joker episodes or Batman episodes for me. This is your time to shine, Tim.
Yep. I know some things, people. I know some things.
Yes, so as Tim is alluding to, this week we are talking about 2011's Moneyball, starring Brad Pitt and Jonah Hill and Philip Seymour Hoffman, a few other folks. And this one follows what is touted as the true story of the Oakland A's, the Oakland Athletics, their 2002 season?
Yeah, so the top of this movie starts with the 2001 season, but then the bulk of the movie is going to follow the entirety of the off-season preceding and then the season of 2002.
Right. So first things first, we want to make sure that we're focusing on the movie. Is this a good movie? But it's going to be really hard to not fall down some rabbit holes when we get into the fact versus fiction and where is this all coming from? Because, obviously discussions can be had about how accurate the depiction is. Sure. But this movie is a movie based on actual events. And so there is truth behind it. Yeah,
it's really kind of fascinating. As I watched this movie, I found it impossible not to have my phone in hand, constantly Googling stats. And I lived these years. I understand baseball at this point. I've seen a lot of baseball at this point. I've, been watching since 96. I'm very familiar with these Oakland teams because the Yankees faced them in the playoffs for a couple of years. And that's what happens. I can tell you, in the 90s, it was the Rangers and Boston and Cleveland. And then in the 2000s, it was always the Angels or the Athletics or, Seattle too, a lot. So I remember these teams and the way this movie opens is highlights or if you're, from the Athletics side, lowlights of, again, the 2001 American League Division Series between the Yankees and the Athletics, where the A's took a 2-0 lead in the best-of-5 series, and the Yankees came back to win 3 straight to eliminate them, partially because Derek Jeter made what his signature career play in the playoffs called the flip play. Look it up if you've never seen it. It's a crazy play for a shortstop. And actually tags out Jeremy Giambi at home plate to keep a 1-0 lead, and he factors big into the story of Moneyball. So I'm intimately familiar with this. So again, it was really hard to just sit and watch this movie. I was constantly looking up stats. I was like, oh yeah, putting those pieces together. So I thoroughly enjoyed that aspect of it for sure.
And I'm going to come back to that with you in just a minute, because for me, I could care less about baseball. I'll watch it casually with people if someone has it on. I can have a relatively intelligent conversation about it just because I try to follow all sports a little bit. But for me, I think I can lean heavy on the film itself, right?
Yeah.
So when we're talking about it, we'll probably split here a little bit into two camps of accuracy for you versus just straight watchability for me. So hopefully we'll touch on a little bit for everyone, and without alienating folks who didn't come here to listen to a statistical breakdown about the 2002 Oakland Athletics and how they factored into baseball on the whole.
Yep.
So, let's dive in, as we always do. Again, like I said, Moneyball from 2011. Where can you watch it? Amazon Prime Video. It is available to stream right now. Spoiler alert. So if you want to go watch it before hearing this episode, go do so right now, because we're going to be breaking down some stuff and talking about some stuff that might spoil parts of the movie. And by might, it totally will. So if you hate spoilers and you know you want to see this, go check it out and then come back here. Otherwise, you're welcome to stay tuned, because more is coming literally right now. Moneyball is rated PG-13 and did really well with critics and audiences alike. On Rotten Tomatoes, a 94% from critics and 86% from audiences. Runtime just over 2 hours, 2 hours, 13 minutes. Budget. Let's talk about that first, because I feel like normally we talk director and that kind of jazz, but there's a lot of little interesting tidbits that happen in development and pre-production of this movie.
Yeah, for sure.
So budget-wise, again, a successful movie. It was a $50 million budget, somewhere between 50 and 58 million at the end of the day. But the worldwide gross for this was $110 million, which, I mean, if you really think about it, so by our standard, pretty good, right? You double the budget, you at least break even. So, this movie at least made its money back, maybe turned a little bit of a profit, but for such a niche topic, right? A team that at the time, maybe not a lot of people are that familiar with anymore, a concept with sabermetrics that, like, it's like the Attack of the Clones of a movie, right? Where it's like, it's a sports movie, but it's also just really heavy on data analytics, and you're just kind of like, for it to draw that kind of a crowd is pretty impressive.
I mean, and I don't think that the public at large has picked up and read the book, right?
Guaranteed not. Yeah.
I mean, we don't read books. I'm familiar with the existence of the book, but
I thought you were going to say I'm familiar with the existence of books.
I am familiar with the existence of books, but I've heard that there are places that sell them, and even some that like rent them to you for like a period of time. Like, you can go and bring it home for a little while, and then you got to bring it back. Like, it's fascinating.
What?
But I don't think that the average person walks into one of those places and says, "Ooh, I'm curious about baseball. Let me read this."
I'm curious about baseball, but really, I'm curious about deep data analytics and algorithms that power kind of a maligned subsection of baseball.
Right. And not even necessarily like you're going to pick this up and you're going to read about star players, right? Like, this isn't the ABCs of baseball where you're going to read about Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig and Joe DiMaggio. This is, hey, let's read about people who are undervalued by everyone else in the league and why we think that this is the way to run a poverty franchise.
Oh, and in the context of a team that wins nothing.
Right. So this is really a book about how to do nothing with nothing and still accomplish nothing, but act like you're competitive.
This is a book about how everything you know about baseball is about to change, except for everything you know about baseball.
Right.
Which will stay exactly the same. Yeah, man. So, but as a movie, successful given this, right? Like, this is, how do you make something like this interesting, right? Where Star Wars could not make intergalactic trade negotiations interesting. Somehow Moneyball makes this watchable. Right. Okay, directed by Bennett Miller, who you may know from Capote. He directed Capote. And also, after this movie, did Foxcatcher. Capote came first. Writers. This went through a lot of writers. So originally, when the book was optioned by Sony, they brought Stan Shervin on board to write this. This would have been his first feature, and is, right? He still retains a writing credit or a story by credit, I think. And after this, he made Space Warriors, and that's all. So it's with, so Shervin writes it. It kind of goes through a process. Things aren't really going well. They sort of clean house, and they bring in Steven Soderbergh to direct, right, and to work on the script. And when Soderbergh comes on, he really wants to make a movie kind of in line of what is it, Act of Valor or something like that. You remember there was a moment in time where they were making lots of like military movies with actual military personnel and that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this was going to be kind of the same thing with baseball. He wanted, the real guys to play themselves in the movie. Like Art Howe was going to play himself as the manager of the team.
Interesting.
Right. So he really had this vision to do that. Now, Sony in the end doesn't dig it. And they decide to pull the plug completely, saying that it's now just too artsy. It's just too out there, and it's not going to have the mainstream pull that people are hoping for.
Yeah, that's fairly interesting. I mean, I think about, we're talking again about 2002, and a good section of these players were at the tail ends of their career. I mean, David Justice, he's 55 now, and we're talking 10 years ago. So he would have been 45 playing, like a 35-year-old.
Mm. He could have pulled it. Yeah, sure.
Might have worked out, but a little weird.
Yeah. Well, but if the scale slides equally for everyone, you know what I mean?
So,
but I think that, that just wouldn't have worked, right?
Yeah.
There are moments in this movie, for example, several of the scouts that you see in this movie are real MLB scouts. And those moments, you can pick them out of a lineup. Right?
Yeah.
Terrible acting. Just stuff is a little too on the nose. Little comments that they make. There's a line by one of the guys where he's just like, they're in a room hashing out the lineup and who they're gonna pick up and who they're gonna sign. And Brad Pitt as the GM, Billy Beane, is arguing for this sabermetrics approach. And we'll get to more of this in a second, but. This one old man just chimes up and is like, guys, we got to remember, this man is the man. He answers only to ownership and God himself. We make suggestions, right? And he does this whole little bit, and it's terribly delivered. And the whole time you're just sitting there kind of like, all right, this is a real guy. And to imagine, which for a moment is forgivable, but imagine an entire movie where every single person on camera is a non-professional. Like, you wouldn't let a baseball scout come and like do your breaks, right? Like, why are we gonna let them come and act?
That's gonna, it ends up like, especially if you're gonna still put them opposite like Brad Pitt, who is a powerhouse in Hollywood,
right? And
you're gonna put a bunch of guys who don't act. And if you've ever seen a baseball team try and use their players in commercials, they're horrendous. I mean, they are horrendous. So you're going to put them in a feature film. You're going to like knock this down to like, Rescue 911 recreations.
Make a documentary.
Yeah.
Like if that's what you want to do, make a documentary.
Yep.
So, anyways, 5 days before production is supposed to start off, Sony pulls the plug, rather. Just totally pulls the plug on the movie and puts it in, and I've never heard this term, limited turnaround. So, turnaround on a film is normally a company goes in, a studio, rather, goes in to make a movie. Something happens, right? Something's going wrong. People pull out. Stuff goes wrong. Budgets are skyrocketing. Whatever is happening, and they decide we are no longer going to make this movie. They put the film in turnaround. What this allows the studio to do is take a property they now own, right? The studio has bought and paid for the rights to this movie.
Right.
But they're spending money on it with the idea that when they release the movie, they're going to make that money and more back. That's the gamble, right? Studios will make somewhere between 10 and 15 films in a year. Maybe 2 of them are major profitable, and your hope is that those 2 to 5 that make you money will fund all the losses that you take on the other 7 to 12 and make you profit. Right. Hence, that's why, the Marvel franchise is what it is. When you're making $1 billion on a movie that costs you $200 million to make, then it can absorb a lot of the hits, which Disney doesn't really take a lot of hits.
Right.
But it can absorb the ones that they do take and still keep them in the black. Right.
Right.
And so the idea with turnaround is they're going to declare it a loss. So the studio is going to say, we own Moneyball. We're putting it in turnaround. They're going to actually claim it as a loss, and they're going to do it on their taxes. Mm-hmm. But because of that, they can no longer make that movie because they've taken the tax benefit to get that money back, right? So so usually what happens is they now have the option to sell it off and give the rights to somebody else and shop it around.
Sure.
Sony does this, but they still end up making the movie after studios like Universal and Paramount and Warner Brothers, I think, all pass on it. So I don't know how this works. I don't know if the addition of limited, I don't know. I don't have an answer for that. So, but basically Sony pulls the plugs and says, we're going to take this loss. But it doesn't really intend, when no one else wants it, they make Brad Pitt a producer. They kick Soderbergh to the curb. They bring in Bennett Miller. They also bring in, the head of Sony brings in Aaron Sorkin to do the rewrites. So Aaron Sorkin comes in and does some minor rewrites. However, and he plays it off like they're minor. And the truth is, when I found out this movie was written by Aaron Sorkin, I was like, but I enjoy it because it doesn't feel like Aaron Sorkin.
Right.
And the reason for that is that it was originally, the screenplay had been written by, when they got rid of Stan Chervin, they brought in Steven Zaillian, who is a powerhouse of screenwriting. He wrote Awakening, Schindler's List, Clear and Present Danger, Mission Impossible, Hannibal, Gangs of New York, American Gangster, Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, The Irishman, and so many others that you totally know. Right? Yeah. And so Sorkin comes in and he's like, look, the script is pretty great. There's really not much I can do here.
Yeah, right.
So I'll clean it up a bit, et cetera, et cetera. But it seems like some of those cleanups are a little bit more than he's leading on because there are characters in this movie who had lent their names, right? The main one being, so obviously Billy Beane, played by Brad Pitt, is the GM. Jonah Hill plays a character named Peter Brand. And Peter Brand is the assistant GM of the Oakland Athletics. But the real guy is a guy named Paul De Podesta. I always say his name wrong. Paul De Podesta. If you're a football fan now, you know that a couple years ago, like 2016 or so, the NFL poached him from Major League Baseball, and he joined the Cleveland Browns as their executive, the head of football operations, effectively, right? I don't think it's officially his title, but he's kind of like the de facto president of operations.
Right.
And, with the goal to kind of bring this whole sabermetrics thing to the Browns. Now, De Podesta had given his name to the movie, but when Sorkin rewrote the script, he changed enough of the characters and their depictions and portrayals that he did not want his name tied to the movie anymore and refused to allow them to use it. So they had to change the character's name to Peter Brand. But it really is supposedly his story. But again, how accurate if he's like, I don't really want my name tied to this.
Yeah, I mean, that's if as it, plays out in the movie, like really all credit goes to him, why would he not want that credit? I mean, Billy Beane is sort of nothing without this character that Jonah Hill portrays coming in and really introducing these ideas to him, right? By happenstance, right? In this,
but there's a lot of questions, right? There's questions about, like, they were already there. All right, we'll get to that. We'll get to that. All right, the last thing that's worth mentioning, you've already mentioned it. It is based on the book. The book is called Moneyball, The Art of Winning an Unfair Game, written by Michael Lewis. So that is the foundation of what this movie is based on.
Yep.
Well, that and the real life events. All right, moving on. The synopsis. We've kind of alluded to most of it, but the Oakland A's general manager, Billy Beane's successful attempt to assemble a baseball team on a lean budget by employing computer-generated analysis to acquire new players. That's the bit.
That's it.
We come into, you mentioned we see the failings of 2001 in the postseason to the Yankees. This is using a team that has done traditional scouting and signing to bring in players. They've got some homegrown talent with, you mentioned Giambi, and who's the other one? Damon?
You have Johnny Damon and then pitcher Jason Isringhausen.
So these are big-name guys who at the end of the season had successful years, and they get poached by some of the richer teams, right? The Yankees take Giambi. The Sox take...
Johnny Damon ends up signing with the Red Sox, and he becomes a huge part of their World Series championship in 2004. And I don't know where Jason Isringhausen ended up.
And I don't think that's even described in the film.
Yeah.
But the idea being, right, that the A's have this lean budget, right? They've got an ownership that is not willing to spend a ton.
He ended up with, after the 2001 series, he played out the rest of his career pretty much with St. Louis.
Gotcha. So the point being that when these guys come up for contract years, the A's can't afford to keep them. They can't offer the same money that some of the richer teams can offer. The whole idea, right? I mean, this is a little foreign to me. I watch football. I'm a big football guy. Yep. And in football, every team must adhere to the salary cap, right?
Yeah.
I know basketball has a salary cap, and in football, like this was the first year in a couple years the cap didn't go up. And there's workarounds, right? Like I don't think signing bonuses are part of the salary cap, things like that. Yep. So if you are a bigger market team, in theory, you can still find ways to kind of work around. That's why with the NFL especially, you hear a lot of like backloaded contracts, right?
Yes.
It's like $120 million over 10 years, but they're making like $2 million in the first 2 years, and then it's, they're going to cut you before they really owe you the bulk of that money.
Absolutely. And baseball is the last of the four major sports to not put any sort of salary cap.
The idea here in the movie being these guys come up for contracts, Oakland can't pay them, other richer teams take them, and Billy Beane is frustrated. And he goes to ownership and he's like, if you really want, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how close we get. It doesn't matter how well we do in the regular season. It doesn't matter if we're not winning a championship. And in order to do that, I need more money. I need to be competitive. We catch a glimpse that he loses one player by the difference of $500,000. Right. He was on board to pay this cat $7.5. Right, the Yankees offer $7.75, and if he can come in at $8, then he'll stay, and he can't do it. So he's not even asking for tons of money. He just needs a little bit more that he can be competitive from the poaching.
And we even see later on in the 2002 season that at the trade deadline, Billy Beane offers to kick in his own money in order to cover the salary of a player that they're trying to acquire.
Right, with the idea that he will get money back when he sells them for more later, because he sees value in this person.
Right. Yep.
So this brings us in the film, and I guess here's my biggest take. And let's start off with, we've started, but let's touch on our thoughts of the movie. Tim, I want to start with you. Set everything aside, at least a little bit.
Yep.
I know it factored in the background.
Sure.
This movie, as a sports drama, as a biopic in a way.
Yep.
What were your thoughts?
I really, really enjoyed it. And I think it's a lot. For a topic that is controversial, again, trying to set aside everything that I know, it's still a really good movie, and it gets you to root for this team, right? And you want them to pull through. And, even though the outcomes of some of this stuff as a baseball fan, it doesn't make it any less exciting. They go on this win streak, and you feel the tension when, they blow an 11-0 lead, which in and of itself sounds like fiction, right?
Well, and especially when they tie it so strongly to the superstition of, if he watches a game, he'll curse them.
Right. Which is all legit stuff, right? People have superstitions. Like, I don't, if my team wins, I sit in the same seat during the playoffs, or I won't wash the shirt I wore until they lose, or something like that, right? That is a baseball thing, baseball superstition. But for me, ultimately, I feel like this movie did everything right. And again, particularly in the baseball sense, that a movie like For Love of the Game, which we did last year, does wrong in terms of getting you to care about baseball. Like, it's using the baseball to tell a story, and some of those facts, again, are stranger than fiction themselves. Again, right? 11-0 lead, they blow it, and then, Hatteberg pinch hits a home run to win the game and to break, this record for straight wins in 20 straight wins in a season. Like, you can't write some stuff better than that, than some true baseball stories. But it's also, again, it's an industry movie, right? I talked about this a little bit with, like with Morning Glory. I have a thing for industry movies. Like, ooh, I'm getting a peek behind the curtain. And it's like, it's not all necessarily glamour and glitz. And, as a fan, you see your GM or your coach one way, but now you're getting to kind of like, peel that back a little bit and be like, oh, this is what you're doing on a day-to-day. So that was super fascinating. The whole deadline scene where they're like haggling, trying to make deals, calling up the other GMs on other teams. And they're like, hey, first name basis, like, I got this guy. Oh, you don't want that guy. Let me give you this guy. And then I'll get the other guy on the phone, right? All that wheeling and dealing. It's a 2-hour and 15-minute movie, we said? 13 minutes?
Yeah.
And every part of it is enjoyable, and it moves, and it tells the story coherently and kind of quickly for being 2 hours and 13 minutes. I mean, even Carissa looked at me and she was like, yeah, this is really cool. This is really fascinating. All this statistical stuff and all the math in this. And she likes baseball. She's a Cubs fan. She was right there when they won the World Series in 2016. But not somebody that I would ever expect to be like, ooh, I like this, baseball movie. But as a movie, it's a really good movie.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. As a non-baseball fan, I was riveted. This is one of my favorite movies. My wife Alyssa loves it too. We watch it together fairly often. And in fact, when we were rewatching it for this, when I told her what I had to watch, she was just like, oh, yeah, wait for me. I want to see it again too, right? And, it's one of these movies that I will often I would say I probably watch it somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 to 6 times a year. It's an easy watch. It's enjoyable. It's interesting. And a lot of the characters are just really well written. And this is, again, not paying any mind or attention to the accuracy of the depiction of these characters.
Yeah.
But everything makes sense. Everything has its moment and its time, with a few exceptions. My criticisms of this movie would be, I think the family dynamics that are portrayed, or the attempt at some family drama, just feels very out of place. There's a whole scene in this movie, right? We talked about this movie's 2 hours, 13 minutes. I don't think it needed to be.
Yeah.
Right? There's a whole scene where Billy Beane goes to pick up his daughter, Casey, I think is her name.
Yeah.
And she's not there. She's out with friends. And so Robin Wright plays his ex-wife, and some rando plays her new husband, I guess. They have this McMansion of a house on the water, whatever. You know, did they get some of his money? Is the dude super rich? I don't know. He was wearing sandals, and it's all I could see.
In his house.
Yeah. Cover your toes, man. Are the socks broken in your home, son? It was, anyways, but the point is, he goes in there, and we just have this whole scene where there seems to be some sort of parent tension, right? Like he finds out that they bought the little girl a cell phone for emergencies, and he just kind of, does his big parenting decision, huh? Right. His mother and I will discuss this. And then there's just random scenes with the daughter. They're buying guitars. He's taking her to the airport. Does he have to fly? Does she have to fly to visit him in Oakland from where they live? And if so, how did he get to their house when he went to pick her up? Right? Like, I'm just, again, since it's not really well explored, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. Except to give some incentive and some explanation as to why Billy Beane may want to stay in the Oakland area.
Yeah, I would also say that it maybe also it humanizes him a little bit, because I think for a little bit early in the movie, he, his approach to players is sort of off-putting for a little, in the beginning, where he's like, oh, let's reduce them to numbers. I don't really care about them. The whole thing where they talk about firing. He's like, just cut them loose. Like, there should be no feelings in this.
And then there's the scene on the plane where David Justice is talking to Brand, and he's just like, why doesn't your boss travel with the team? Is it to make us easier to cut? And he's like, yeah, exactly why.
But to your point, though, I think ultimately he humanizes himself later in the movie when he ends up mixing it up with the team, right? And he's in the
kind of
room.
Coaching them.
Exactly. So, I don't know that we need that extra 15 minutes. That there's... It's whatever.
There's enough to enjoy there. Now, here's the other thing, and to kind of bring in a little bit of the accuracy conversation, I want us to try to sprinkle it in as we discuss the movie itself, just to kind of keep us from going too far off the rails. But Billy Beane in real life, he did get divorced, right? Mm-hmm. And but he remarried very quickly. And in the time when this is taking place, in 2002, he was already remarried to his second wife, who is, I believe, still his wife today, Tara Beane. And now originally, and apparently in the Blu-ray, there are deleted scenes where we see someone was cast as Tara Beane and had roles in the movie. And I just can't help but wonder if it just would have been better served. There is enough conflict in this movie in the whole notion of taking this sabermetrics and applying it to baseball. So in terms of conflict, it's exactly what you think it is. Billy Beane has no money, and he needs to buck the traditional trend. And instead of scouting and signing players that he knows in a couple of years he's going to lose to the bigger teams anyway, how can he form winning teams in budget using players that no one else wants?
Right.
And the idea is to use these metrics, right? So to replace one Giambi, he has to replace 38 runs. And how can he do that? Well, for less than the cost of one Giambi, he can get 4 guys who have the same output, right? Or for this guy, instead of this one guy, he can bring in this guy who gives him essentially he's just replacing runs, because he figures if he gets those same runs, he can get the same wins, and he can be just as successful for a fraction of the cost. And this goes against everything that people of baseball know and love and respect about the game. So this conflict, because if this does not work, right? If he's the first to do it and it fails, he'll lose his job, his livelihood. There's a scene with his daughter where she's like, if you get fired, will you have to move? Because it isn't working at first. Right? There's enough conflict there that we can do the traditional approach. I don't need to see Robin Wright. I don't need to see this tool bag of a new husband. That is a nonsensical scene. And instead, just show me the supportive Tara Beane when he's struggling and she's like, don't worry, big guy, like, you can do, we've been through worse before, and if you get fired, we'll just go somewhere new. I'm with you, ride or die, right? Like, you can have those cliche moments and humanize him and show him getting the support and all that kind of stuff as a family guy without having these elements that just don't play any factor whatsoever.
Yeah, I mean, it's, specifically, again, when you get into, a criticism of a lot of the major sports is that, it's like the good old boys club, right? Like, if you've made a name for yourself in any way, or you're someone's protege, just because it doesn't work out here doesn't mean your career's over for the most part. You're going to get a chance somewhere else. And maybe that somewhere else is someplace with more money, right? And as we sort of see at the end of this, right, the Red Sox come courting Billy Beane to do what exactly? I don't know.
to not win a World Series.
Right, I guess. Like, they end up winning their own World Series with a huge payroll. So I'm not really sure what interest they had in his style of managing or GMing, but maybe it was just because he was a good GM otherwise and could do the job equally as well if he had an unlimited budget. I don't know. Right. But yeah, I don't know.
There are some really, really great movie scenes in this, though. When the hunt for the players, right, these down and out, everyone's ridden them off, that innately builds and endears you to them, and you are instantly rooting for these guys, right?
Yes.
One of the first ones is Hatteberg, played by Chris Pratt. He's a catcher. His life is over. No one's calling. The phone's not ringing. We see him. It's New Year's, it seems.
Yep.
And he's at home just sort of feeling real down, sitting on the couch watching the ball drop. We see he's got a little girl. He's got a wife who looks like she's crunching some numbers. Right? She's doing some family budgeting, and everyone seems pretty stressed and tense. And then that phone rings, and it's Billy Beane, and he wants to give him a second life and give him a second chance as a first baseman, right? Yeah. And so you're immediately rooting for this guy, and you want to see him make that transition, and then you're rooting against manager Art Howe when he's not playing Hatteberg at first. So it's messing up with the metrics game. It's messing up with Billy's scheme. It's messing with our boy Hattie, right? Yep. And all of that builds so nicely in this movie. And this is something that I feel is just so, it's not unique, but it's so easy to fall in love with sports movies because the romanticism is there. When they sign Hattie is some of the best lines where Billy Beane comes with one of the scouts / coaches.
Ron Washington, who is actually a very well-respected manager in baseball. He goes on to manage the Texas Rangers. He's been a coach on many, many teams, well respected for his baseball knowledge and especially infield work. So
that's shocking to hear because he's also a pretty solid actor. Yeah. He is in this scene.
Well, that wasn't him. Like,
so an actor playing Ron Washington.
Yes.
All right. See, I don't know these things, Tim. You need to be more clear.
He was also arrested for cocaine at one point during his managerial career.
The actor or the man?
The man himself.
Can't it be both?
Could be.
All right. So the character / real life guy / but actor, the guy playing Ron Washington in the movie is there with Billy Beane, and they're talking to Hattie, and they're telling him he's got to transition to first base. And Hatteberg's like, I've never done first base before. And Billy Beane's like, relax. It's really not that hard. The guy just goes, it is incredibly hard. He's like, but what in life that's worth doing isn't? There's these really great moments of dialogue where I like to think when Sorkin took over, one of his deals was that he wouldn't remove any of the other writers because the script was great and there wasn't much he could change. Besides making it a little more fictionalized and maybe forcing in some of these family elements, I like to think it's moments like these interactions, these quirky little comments back and forth that he does add in and sprinkles enough of his Sorkinisms that it keeps it entertaining without being overbearing and garbage pail.
Yeah, because I think this is, one spot where I'll start to kind of interject a little bit of, truthiness to this. Like Hatteberg has said in his, he disagrees with some of the portrayal, specifically of Art Howe and their relationship. But coming at this from a baseball fan, this type of thing is not as unheard of as they really make it out to be, especially for a catcher to go to first base. Especially if you're doing it in the off season and you have a spring training. Yes. Are there nuances that, a seasoned first baseman is going to get over someone who's just going to switch to the position? Absolutely. But again, someone like Ron Washington, who is known for being a good fundamentals coach and a good infield coach, a catcher pretty much calls the game of baseball and has a feel. That's why catchers go on to be some of the greatest managers in the sport, is because they're sort of managing the game as it is already, right? They have a feel for it. So that I think is sensationalized a little bit, the difficulty there. Is it a quirk? Yes, absolutely. But, players play different positions. And especially at this time in your young career, you've played multiple positions. You've played other positions at some point. Nowadays, kids are a lot more specialized and maybe don't play. If you're a pitcher in high school, maybe you're pitching all the way through and never touching another position. And you might haven't picked up a bat in 15 years by the time you get to the major leagues, right? So this part, I definitely think is played up a little bit. Is it funny? Is it endearing? Yes, I thought this was a great scene. I think the redemption there for him is great. He had been playing since '95 with Boston, and then he gets hurt, and he wasn't going to catch again because he can't throw, right? And this resurrects his career. He goes on to play until 2008 and has some of his, most games played following this 2002 season with Oakland, and then goes on to play with Cincinnati for 06, 07, and 08. So this is a redemption of his career, because his career could have ended, halfway, sooner than it did.
Yeah. And this movie is filled with these little moments and these great one-liners that are really well delivered, especially by Brad Pitt. I buy him, man. I totally buy Brad Pitt as a failed player turned GM who gets the game, but he gets it from the player's perspective. We see great lines with that. His interaction with David Justice is one of my favorite moments, when Justice comes in and he's like, I'm an all-star, man. I'm this, I'm that. And Billy Beane is basically like, that's not why you're here. Right? You're here to get on base and to teach these young kids and coach them up, right? There's anyone who watches any sport is familiar where you sign these vets as a locker room presence.
Yeah, and the Yankees gave him away, so why not? I mean, Justice is a career player. He's an all-star at this point, and the Yankees are paying half his salary. So
and that's the best part, when he's just he's like, you're paying me $7.5 million to, do this. Why don't you let me worry about this and you worry about you? And he's like, I'm not paying you $7.5 million. The Yankees are paying half your salary.
I loved that, because I was
they're paying you $3.25 million to play against them. Right? Like, that's what they think of you.
I thought it was hilarious. I loved it because that kind of thing happens all the time. The Yankees made a bunch of trades this year for guys that other teams are paid us to take them.
Yeah.
So, and play the rest of the season for us to get them off their books, right? To free up whatever, to get some assets back. But that whole scene was hilarious because I did a double take. I was like, they're not paying anybody $7 million for this season. That was what this whole thing was about. And so that line delivered, he's like, we're getting paid by somebody else, was great.
He's just hilarious. Like, you want to stay in the show and I want to milk the last drop of baseball you got. So let's just do this, right? And it's such a great moment, and Brad Pitt just brings it home. The last thing so here's what I really enjoyed.
Yeah.
I would nix all the family stuff. I really, really, really liked the flashback scenes of how the traditional system failed him.
Yeah.
As a scouted player in the traditional way, he was marked as a first round guy, and this is the way that he tests Brand, right? Peter Brand.
Yeah.
He says, would you have taken me in the first round? And Peter Brand's like, I would have taken you in the 8th round, no signing bonus, and blah, blah, blah. And I imagine you would have gone to college and turned it down. And he sees the honesty and that his analytics has truth. Because where everyone else saw like a 5-tool guy, right? His Peter Brand's system sees not really much value. And and it would have projected what now hindsight is what it is too, right? Peter Brand's not looking at the numbers and making a foreshadowing conclusion. Right. He also has history on his side to say that I know you're a washout. But I really love those flashback moments and how they feed into the current, into like the present day narrative as to how he's handling things, but also sets up the biases he may carry into this and how he might feel because he was done dirty in his eyes, you know?
Yeah. I'll also add too that from a knowledge perspective, knowing all of what is knowing or having cursory knowledge of what is happening in the current day events of the film, it was great to throw that history in there. I'm familiar with Billy Beane. I know the name. I know Moneyball. I understand all that. But I didn't know he was a player. I didn't know he was drafted by the Mets. I didn't know that he was projected to be a superstar. Baseball is one of those sports where first overall picks, or high draft picks doesn't really mean squat in the grand scheme of things. You and I talked earlier today, hockey, baseball, football, if you're drafted in the first round or first overall, you're playing in the league next year. Mm-hmm. Baseball, you might never play. Like, you are so far down the ladder that you might burn out, break down, quit before you ever get to the mound. And, to see that, to add that kind of context was awesome. I was like, oh, I didn't realize that. I didn't realize that he has some other personal things here, right? Like you said, he was done dirty, to a degree. He was all this money was thrown at him, didn't go to college, and he played 4 or 5 years and was terrible.
Yeah. And I really love those moments. In terms of the writing, I thought they were well executed, and where they were placed throughout the narrative to kind of add a little bit more to those moments. One more criticism, though, is, we're watching a movie. I mean, this almost could be a Disney movie, right? We're following a team that doesn't win anything. It's cool runnings. It's all that kind of jazz where, all of these efforts and all this sabermetrics, it only gets them as far as they got the year before it.
Yes.
And without it, right? And but it did keep them competitive after losing all those guys. Yeah. That being said, though, it really, as a way, in an effort for the movie to justify this approach and to say Billy Beane actually won and Billy Beane was right, and everything you just spent the last 2 hours and 13 minutes watching wasn't for nothing, right? We see a couple of win conditions. The first is that the A's this year break the MLB record for most consecutive wins in a season. They get 20 consecutive wins, more than any other team in the American League in history, right? Yep,
I believe so.
And then in the end, we see that Billy Beane gets courted by a big club, by the Boston Red Sox, and they offer him $12.5 million to make him the highest paid general manager at the time in sporting history, not just baseball. Right. He turns it down to stay with the A's, presumably to stay close to his daughter, right? We see a nice little moment between him and his daughter where she's worried if he gets fired, he's going to have to move. So again, this is why I'm saying, like, is this the only reason that we force-fed us some of these moments, was so that we would feel, that it made sense that he would turn it down? Peter Brand, I guess, also stays, but the real Paul De Podesta, he eventually leaves. Billy Beane is still with the A's. He's, he's the executive vice president or whatever of operations, and he's also a minority owner. He owns a couple of soccer clubs, et cetera, et cetera. So he's still an executive, and he's still with the A's, just not the GM anymore. But before we kind of wrap with some of the final notes on what was maybe not so accurate, one of the failings maybe of this movie is, I guess in a way, when it ends, you still kind of feel like he won. You feel like he was validated. You feel like the approach was validated. But I feel like the movie could have done a better job of building up the streak, of really tracking that and really making that a major highlight and a milestone. It's not that it doesn't, but it feels like just one part of the journey that then suddenly comes to a very abrupt end.
Yeah, and to that point too, right? They're preaching very specific things, right? You know, you're paying me to steal bases. No, we're not. We're paying you to get on base, right? We're paying you to walk. We're paying you to do this.
Right. We're paying you to get on first, not get thrown out at second.
Right. Yeah. You know, all of these things. And then all happens in a montage. We don't necessarily...
And there's such good moments. I want more of it.
We don't necessarily see those things, or the players buying into those moments, right? We get some of that tension, like,
we don't see a guy who had been stealing a bunch of bases now staying put at first and running one in and being like, oh, snap, he's right.
They attempt to do that in these conversations that... that he's having with the players, right? So you see them in the weight room and they're having philosophical discussions and they're like, oh, I get it. But like,
right.
I want to see that play out, right? Let's see that on the field a little bit. But instead, we're treated to the standings changing and, a couple of big plays here and there, and the A's are really hitting. Okay. But let's see that start to click, because otherwise it could just be a team getting hot. Every team can go on a win streak. I don't care how bad you are. Baseball, again, is a unique sport in that your team is only as good as your starting pitcher takes you that day. Right?
So this is a really interesting transition into one of our last points of the evening, which is how accurate. So I wonder if, and I'll pose this as a question, we don't get a lot of that. We don't get a lot of the details about who's doing what and what's going on. Right. And perhaps it is because there's the major criticism of this movie and of the book. You talked a little bit about the portrayal of Art Howe and some of this other stuff, but it's the real question of how accurate is it to say that this sabermetrics and the signing of some of these guys really had that big of an impact on this team to keep them successful, because the truth of it is that they had 3 all-star pitchers who were homegrown and like traditionally scouted, and they also had 2 positional players. I think a shortstop, you'd probably know. Yeah, Miguel Tejada and Eric Chavez. Who, again, traditionally scouted guys who arguably carried a lot of the load. And perhaps the film couldn't show like, oh, David Justice, Scott Hatteberger, whatever, because we totally ignored the fact that there are still some all-stars, Cy Young winners, Golden Glove winners on this team.
Yeah, and it's funny, when I started doing the research, that was one of the things in the back of my head. I was like, man, at this point in time, Oakland had Tim Hudson, Mark Mulder, and Barry Zito, who were like the big 3. They were the 3 best pitchers, and Barry Zito went on to win the Cy Young in 2002. They, in a best of 5, going against those 3 guys was a nightmare, because they were really, really good.
For those who don't know, the Cy Young is the best pitcher in baseball award.
Correct. It usually judged on wins and losses. It's sort of starting to change as we've entered kind of a quasi-weird time in baseball stats, where people are actually looking more at the whole pitcher and looking at, your earned run average, which is how many runs you give up per 9 innings pitched. But that said, all these guys that you mentioned and these pitchers, they were all, on their first contracts. They were all, getting, maybe minimum at some point. They were not due for their payday. When they were due for their payday, they left Oakland. They left. Right? They were priced out. So this is a perfect storm in 2002 of you're padding the roster with some of these guys like Giambi and Hatteberg. Giambi had been on the team. He'd been on the team in 2001 when his brother was on the team. He sucked. He was not a good player. He played a couple more years after the trade to Philly, but maybe one or two. He was never as good as his brother. And this whole thing that he would, he was a guy that they wanted. Why? Because those numbers sort of told you that. Sure.
They also make it. That seems to. There's a scene where it's implied Billy Beane cuts or trades Pena and Giambi, pretty much anybody that Art Howe could use to not start Hatterberg, right? He just cleans house to make a statement to Art Howe, the manager of the team, play my guys the way I want you to play them, or else I'll just keep trading everybody and leave you with nothing except my guys. And the real world scenario is that they weren't traded at the same time, that it really wasn't this way. And this speaks to Hatterberg, as you mentioned, had come out and said that he totally was against the depiction of Art Howe, that he never felt Howe wasn't in his corner, that kind of stuff. And Art Howe himself has come out and been like, that's nonsense. And that he's really hurt that, he spent 7 years, 5 years, however long with this team, only to find out that this is how, how Billy Beane sees him.
And again, this is the, sort of the good old boys club, right? A lot of these managers get recycled. So why would you ever be that opposed to new ideas, right? Like you have to, the manager of the Chicago White Sox right now came out of retirement. Tony La Russa, he is ancient. And people are like, there's no way that he's going to, adapt to this modern analytical baseball. His team has been playing unreal this year, and his players love him. So again, what good does it do you in that position as a manager to not embrace this technique? You're not going to get the players anyway. You not embracing this is not going to suddenly, materialize another, $100 million for you to sign these players, right? So, yeah, that would be disappointing to see that portrayal of yourself and feel like maybe you were stabbed in the back a little bit. But ultimately, like you said, it does come down to, this is an interesting concept. Everybody likes an underdog story, and this idea of sabermetrics has taken over. Baseball's full of analytics now. It's really interesting to see where this got its start, and this specific type of Moneyball, right? Taking that sabermetrics and using that to analyze these undervalued players. It's also controversial. A lot of teams use it now when they want to stay competitive but slash payroll. Let's tell our fans we're going to stay competitive, but we're going to slash our payroll because our owner doesn't want to pay that much anymore. No team employing this has won a World Series yet. People using sabermetrics have. The Red Sox did in 2004. They hired what was his name? John Lewis, the guy who developed, all these stuff that Peter Brand and Art and Billy Beane use to kind of make this Moneyball thing. And they win in 2004, but their payroll is ridiculous. So, what do we ultimately learn from this movie, from this book? I don't know. It's a really fun ride, but I don't know.
Yeah, it is, and I think that was kind of my final point too, is the movie does play it up as if like this approach is a winning approach, where the reality is they don't win anything more than they won the year before. Yeah. As you call out, it implies that the Red Sox employ this system, but they also pay billions of dollars to their team, so they're kind of dipping into both ends. And Billy Beane goes on to the longest losing streak of any team. After the 2002 season, the Oakland A's don't have a season above 500 for like 11 years or something ridiculous.
They're on the verge of being displaced out of Oakland currently. They're having a good season. They're in the wild card hunt right now, but the Raiders left. They still play in the Coliseum. Right. I believe it's the last multi-purpose stadium in existence. The multi-purpose as in multiple used sports, for football or baseball. And they might be headed somewhere else, soon too, because they're just not making it work. It is, again, this all sounds negative, right? Because the concept of Moneyball has kind of been met negatively. It's not something that's super embraced. Tampa Bay Rays right now are probably the best team to currently employ that, a very small market team playing in a dump. They made the World Series last year. They're poised to make a good run at the World Series this year. They keep doing this, thing where they trade off their big players and replace them with little players. It's a super fascinating thing. It's a great story to be like, how can we do this? How can we compete? But do you really compete?
But I think not even looking at it from a baseball perspective or a sports perspective, but looking at it from a film perspective, right? So that's the end game here is how is this successful as a closing to this journey we just went on, right? I'm supposed to see the resolution. I'm supposed to see the victory moment. I'm supposed to see something. And where a film like, for example, Cool Runnings shows you like the real win is the courage to do it. And in the face of racism and adversity and all these things, right?
Yep.
Here, the movie historically, for historical accuracy, doesn't really have a leg to stand on. And it can't necessarily prove or justify or validate that what we just watched is successful. Right. And so it feels like they have to kind of wrap it up quick at the end. And in the end, you have to ask yourself, like, well, the film sort of fictionalizes things and really twists things to make it seem successful, where the reality is not necessarily so. Like, in the end, him getting the big offer is evidence that he was the reason why they were so successful, when they weren't any more successful than they were the year before.
Well, and if he doesn't find this character, John DePodesta or whatever,
Peter Brand in the movie,
if he doesn't find this character, this person, he doesn't get this idea, right? Well,
and then the other implication or the other assumption is, that the Red Sox employ this and then win the World Series 2 years later, where the Oakland A's are having the worst seasons of their lives with the actual guy who's supposedly, the one who championed it and did it successfly. Well, Boston does it without him by paying people. So it's like, so in the end, as a film, I just watched all this. Did I really see a victory? But as an uninitiated film goer, the movie does a good job at putting forth an ending that leaves you feeling somewhat validated, although it doesn't really hold up to the historical scrutiny, which is what a lot of people have. That's why that audience score is less than the critic score, because people have really lambasted this movie to say, it's totally and wholly inaccurate.
There is there's hope for the future at the end, right? We found a way,
right?
Baseball finds a way,
and that's why we don't get a little written tag about what the Oakland A's have done since then. Yeah, right. It's like Boston was successful, while we have been mired in garbage.
Just because we keep mentioning it, the 2002 season that this is portrayed, the Red Sox had a team payroll of $108 million. And Oakland was at $40 million.
Yeah, that's significant.
So let's jump forward to 2004, which is the year that we're talking that the Red Sox, employed it. Just because I'm having fun doing this. Let's see what that says.
Okay, we'll entertain you too.
2004, the Red Sox are $127 million. And Oakland at this point is... Where did they go?
They vanished off the face of the earth.
They actually rose quite significantly. They're at $59 million 2 years later. So...
And worse off. But but the Red Sox won with $120 million.
They still went 91 and 71 in 2004.
91 seasons, not bad.
Yeah. Yep.
So I will say, in the end, right, all the facts, all the stats, all the baseball talk aside, as a movie, I love it. I think, barring a few things that I wish it didn't have, mainly that family dynamic stuff,
Yep.
And I would have liked either a little more of the background stuff with him, or just a more traditional view of the supportive second wife as he's going through these hard times. I just think it didn't serve a purpose. So that aside, overall, the good outweighs the bad for sure. You mentioned it being an industry film. It totally is, and it's awesome. I'm not a baseball guy, but I love movies that have that wheeling and dealing, sports movies that kind of show that behind the scenes. I love the way they depict it, how they're all kind of buddies. They all kind of know each other, right? In the first time where he meets Peter Brandon, he's negotiating some trades. This is a guy who seems to be a new GM for Cleveland. Yep. And he's just like, man, yeah, that chair fits you well. And whatever. They're just kind of having some banter. And then, but the moments, and I think Brad Pitt as the GM, as Billy Beane, just knocks it out of the park. You totally buy him. He's relatable, but yet you totally see him as this really smart executive who knows how to play the game because he once played the game. Right. Jonah Hill in this movie is a revelation, right? Prior to this, it's big time comedy work, and this is one of his first, excuse the pun, at bats at a truly dramatic role. Yeah, and he totally nails it. Like I'm fully in and invested as him as this analytical guy who can change the face of this game. There's a lot of heart. There's a lot of stuff to root for. There's a lot of good. It hits every note you want a sports movie to hit, and it hits a lot of the notes that you want this behind the scenes industry film to hit. And the acting is stellar, the writing is excellent, and before you know it, it's over. And I loved it, and I watch it over and over again, and I love it every time I do. I give Moneyball an 8.5 out of 10. I think it's a really good and successful film. Whether or not it's accurate, we have kind of shown that it probably isn't. But who cares? It's a really fun movie.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I don't think any of that detracts in a way that, again, a movie like For Love of the Game, which is whole cloth, fiction, like, oh yeah, this guy throws a perfect game in his last game ever, blah, whatever. Like, fine. There is a lot to this, and it doesn't in any way, even again, looking at stats while I'm watching this movie, detract at all from anything that is happening on screen. It is a fascinating peek behind that curtain. Again, I said this before. It is just, I'm a sucker for that. I like seeing that stuff. You get this public image of how a GM works or how a team works. And so you get behind there. Like, the Oakland offices aren't glamorous, right? Like, they could be at the local Parks and Rec for all we know, right? Like, the Coliseum is not that cool. Like, it's old. Like,
there's even a line when he comes back from Boston, he sits down, he goes, ugh, what a dump.
Yeah, right. It's all that kind of little stuff that goes into it. It's not as high glamour as you think. But yeah, none of this detracts. Again, I feel like I was sounding really negative about the fact versus fiction, but it's not. Again, it's more about what this analytical revolution has done to some sports and taken the heart and things out of it. But it's just so fun. It's so fun to watch, and it's so interesting, and it's not hurt by anything, and people who are don't care, it can enjoy it just as much. And I think that is what the testament is, right? That's what it all boils down to for me, is a huge baseball fan can appreciate it for what it is, and someone who just wants to watch a good movie can appreciate it for what it is. And that's where you find that middle ground, and it works very well. It does a really wonderful job balancing that, tells a great story. Yes, there's artistic license to it, but not so much that it does it a disservice.
And the truth is, life is pretty boring, guys. And so when you're going to try to make a story that's interesting to watch, especially by a bunch of people who maybe don't know the nitty gritty,
sure,
you got to take some license. And I think this movie really does pick and choose its moments, and it does it well.
It would be really interesting if they ever, if the writer of the book ever did follow up with this sequel that he had planned called Underdogs, where he wanted to kind of follow up on some of this stuff. I think that would be really interesting, especially, as I said, in light of what this kind of analytics, Moneyball, sabermetrics revolution, whether it has truly worked, but analytics is in baseball, right? So what is the fallout beyond whatever happens with the Oakland A's? What is the fallout from introducing analytical approaches into baseball?
Yeah.
So.
No, dig it. All right, guys. That brings us home.
Yeah.
On yet another amazing episode of the greatest podcast that ever was and ever will be.
Yeah.
Next week is our live show. So 1 week from tonight at 8 p.m., you will find us on IG Live. Please join us there. We love having the conversations. That's where we just talk about whatever it is we've been watching this week. But it's your opportunity to ask us questions and interact and post comments while we're talking that we can address in the moment.
Yep.
The goal for those live shows is to interact with you guys in real time and put your questions out there and just have a good time. So join us next Thursday night at 8 p.m. on IG Live. And obviously, as always, we will be posting the broadcast on YouTube, Facebook, that kind of stuff. But it'll be too late. You won't be able to interact with us live.
Yeah, give us something. Give us. I'm at a loss a little bit right now.
Of what to watch? You looking for some recommendations? Yeah. Send us some recommendations before the live shows or anytime. And you can hit us up on Instagram at Pause Reviews, through the website, pausereviews.com, and on email, pausereviews@gmail.com. We're there. We're here. We're waiting.
Yep.
For you.
Yep.
All right, guys. As always, I'm your boy Frank.
This is Tim.
And we will see you next week on the live show. Peace.
You're out!
Jesus Christ.